Welcome everyone. This is the second episode of the Energized Saga to the P of the EPCIC procurement. My name is Gizela Zucula, and I'm here as the moderator for this episode. It's going to be interesting, and I'm quite sure that all of you are going to like it. Who am I? I am the subcontracting and procurement lead of ETJV, working for Coral project, Coral FLNG project. And I'm here today to be with you and guide you with our guest, our speaker, through this amazing topic that is procurement. I hope you're all going to like. My background has, just for you to know, is a civil engineer. I'm also a Mozambican woman of energy in the energy sector, working as the subcontracting and procurement lead here. And it's a great pleasure to be part of such a good and amazing industry. For those who are new, you might be asking yourself, what is MWE? MWE is a platform of women's engaged to change the narrative of Mozambican women in the energy sector, contributing to sustainable development of our country. The aim of MWE is to increase the number of women in this sector. We want to help young women support, inspire, by identifying, I would say, poor areas to improve and develop. MWE is also with the objective of fighting, I would say, for gender equality. MWE is identified with the 5 SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal number 5. That is the gender equality, where the focus of MWE is to identify excluded groups and create new opportunities for inclusion of these groups in this society. And MWE is also identified with the 7th goal, that it's affordable and clean energy. MWE focus on this goal is to help create a clear policy and regulatory framework that will allow the development and growth of decentralized energy solutions within our country and also all around the world. So this is MWE, and Mozambique Gas Summit, that it's a partner of MWE. It's enough to talk about me and the MWE, because today we have a great guest. She is the contracts and procurement head of Total. You are going to love her, and she's here to talk about the procurement, the P of the EPCIC. So I'm going to call next Lee. You can present yourself, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Gizela, for that introduction. I really appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward and appreciate the opportunity to be with you today to help in a very, very small way with the highly ambitious mission of MWE. So thank you so much for that opportunity. Just a small introduction about myself. My name is Lei von Habsburg. I am a contracts and procurement manager with Total. I've been in Mozambique for quite a while. And it was quite interesting, Gizela, you mentioned in your introduction that you're a civil engineer. And you found your way into procurement. I actually started my career in procurement actually in the law field. So I was a litigator, litigating contracts, and found my way into contracts and procurement. So I think that just also goes to show that the contracts and procurement field, there are many avenues to it. And it's a diverse field with people from many, many diverse backgrounds and diverse educational backgrounds as well. So thanks for that. I think I'll jump into my presentation. I'll share my screen. Gizela, if you can just confirm for me that you can see my screen, we will go from there.
Yes, Lee, we can see your screen.
Okay, fantastic. So here we're just going, it's just the table of contents, a map of what we'll be talking about today. I won't go through it, word for word. It's no fun for you to hear me read slides, so I'll try not to do that. But this is just a map of what we'll talk about today and a bit of a guideline. But first, I'd like to start with a safety moment. HSC, which if you're unfamiliar, I'll try not to talk in jargon because I know that we don't want to lose people, but HSC in the industry, health, safety, and environment is critical. It's absolutely critical. And we should start any conversation about the energy industry, I feel, always in starting with HSC. And that includes procurement. In this industry, we all have an obligation to ensure that every day we get home safely, our colleagues get home safely. And one of the ways we do this in the industry, including in every organization I've ever worked for, to be honest, outside of the legal field, is to start meetings with a safety moment. And so normally we look for a safety moment as something that's relevant to the context that you're working in. And when you're working in an office environment or you're working in an area like procurement, very often people will say, well, how does safety apply to me? And safety applies to everyone. And we all have a role in ensuring that safety is integral to the organization, even in procurement. So what I have here is, I think it's important that when we're considering a relationship with a supplier or a contractor or a company that we haven't done business with before or a partner, it's really important to understand the safety culture, the health and safety culture of that supplier. We can do it in informal ways, where if we're having a discussion with a supplier or contractor, we, in the top of the meeting, we say, listen, we do safety moments. We'd like you to share a safety moment. And that's a really good way to gauge if the supplier or the contractor has a safety conscious organization, because you'll either hear chirps and silence and nothing, or the best thing is when a supplier or contractor will jump right in and say, yes, that's something we do as well. Or if it's not something they do, say, well, that's a really good point and maybe something we should implement. So there are a few questions I think that you can ask when you're trying to evaluate the safety culture of a supplier or a contractor. It's really important to find out, is the safety culture that they have aligned with your organization's safety culture, which is something I mentioned you can do with, throwing out that safety moment and asking them to contribute to a safety moment. But if you find, which very often you'll find with companies that may be slightly less mature or new to the industry, that they're not completely aligned, the next question to ask is, are they willing to improve? Do you see a willingness there and an understanding of how important health and safety is in the organization? And if you find that they're willing to improve, or if you find that they do have that safety culture that we're looking for, the next question to ask that supplier could be, are they committed to continuous improvement? Because in the safety culture, you never finish. There's always ways that we can improve and make our processes safer. In the context of procurement, one of the things we have to do is ensure that if we have a supplier that's manufacturing for us or production facilities, that they are running their production facilities or their factories or even their offices with a safety culture in mind. So I think that's another thing we need to look at. And then finally, we need to make sure whichever partners, contractors, suppliers we work with, that their employees are trained with safety culture in mind, and that they are committed to the expected standards of safety that we in our organization would have. So I'll leave our safety moment, but I'd just like to, I know there's a way for questions. So if you have any questions on anything I say during the presentation, please send them to the moderator. But occasionally I'll throw out questions to you as well. So if you have an answer or something you'd like to contribute, please send that to the moderator, and I think we'll address those at the end of the session. But just closing out our safety moment, I would like to say that it is our responsibility in the procurement space to ensure that not only we as a procurement department or procurement area are HSC advocates, but we also need to ensure that our suppliers, contractors, and stakeholders are committed to the premise that everybody is responsible for the safety of ourselves, for the safety of others, and for the safety of the environment. Okay. So, safety moment done. I think we'll move on to our next slide. This is actually just a bit of levity, just a joke. I think you're probably familiar with this cartoon. It's a Dilbert cartoon. But basically, this is what people generally think the procurement department is. So you need something very simple. He needs, a $1,600 thing. And he goes to the procurement department and they give him a list of everything he needs to do to get it. And then he just says, never mind, I don't need that thing. I'll figure a workaround because the process is just too onerous. So I think this is a really good point to make because, this is what people think of the procurement department very often. So you find resistance to procurement policies and procedures. Our role as the procurement department, yes, it's to get best value for the company. But I think in order to do that, we have to also work with our end users and we have to be a facilitator and a partner. So we have to guide them through the procurement processes. We have to make sure that they're familiar with them. A great reason is to give them examples of why we have certain processes in place. Because, if you throw the procurement policies and procedures at someone in a vacuum and it makes no sense, that's when you'll find people will start to try to find ways to get around the policies and procedures that are put in place to make sure that we are getting best value for client and that we are following our corporate policies and procedures. So I would say that training for your end users and for your technical end users, for the people in your organization about procurement policies and procedures, not at the level that one who's in the department would necessarily need, but definitely a general overview training of why these policies are in place, how they protect the company is important because that's when you get stakeholder buy-in, and stakeholder buy-in will make your job so much easier. So this sort of timeline just talks about, what exactly is procurement for major projects? What does that look like? And the thing that I find most exciting about procurement is you have a contribution at every single stage of the project. From the very first day that a corporate board decides that this is a project we want to pursue, there is a room and a space for procurement. Whether you're in exploration, whether you're in pre-FID, whether you're FID, when you get to constructions, when you get to operations, procurement is a prominent throughout the life cycle of a major project. And that makes for some really interesting career opportunities. Because if you're in a technical field, like Gizela, I think you mentioned you were a civil engineer, you may be a procurement specialist in an area that is really tied to engineering. And that engineering background and that engineering expertise you have works really well in a procurement department, because then when we talk to our end users, they have confidence that we understand their needs. They have confidence that we know what we're talking about. They have confidence that we're going to get them the end result or the end product that really makes sense for the overall project. It's the same thing for if we're looking at the procurement of services, consultancies, studies. One example, let's take the example of social performance. If you have a background in social performance and we're looking to engage consultancies for social performance projects, having that understanding of social performance, the background, the connections with people, social performance objectives, things like license to operate, that's hugely important in your procurement function. So it goes back to say that procurement is such a diverse field and there's really room for people from all types of backgrounds. And then whatever your interests are, you can find it within the procurement area, depending on where you fit into a project or what type of project it is, etc. So now we'll talk a little bit about the primary procurement tools. So it gets slightly more technical, but I think it's important to discuss because we have a toolbox in the procurement field, and to know how to utilize that toolbox is really important because it makes procurement so much more efficient and effective, and we give value to the organization when we understand these tools and are able to use these tools. And for instance, the tool I'll talk about now, which is an ERP, even if you're not in the procurement space, it's something that is important to become familiar with because you will see it. So to think about what an ERP is, an ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. It's basically software which we use for managing various business processes, but managing them in a really integrated way. So the simplest way to think about it is that if you think about all the core processes you need to run a company, so that could be finance, HR, procurement, supply chain, etc. So at the most basic level, an ERP will integrate all of these processes into a single system. So I think an example of an ERP that most people would be familiar with is something like SAP, which is big across the industry. So what's the benefits of an ERP? With an ERP, you generally can see higher productivity. You can streamline and automate your core business processes to ensure that everybody in the organization is able to do more with your resources. You can get deeper insight. So it allows everyone in the organization, as per different functionalities, to see the information that they need, and it all can be found in one place. You can accelerate reporting, which I think in every field, reporting is huge, but particularly in procurement, because in our reporting, we can actually find where there are efficiencies that we may be missing, or cost savings that we may need to catch. So reporting is huge in all fields, but particularly in procurement. We lower risk. And then there's improved agility within an organization, because today's ERP systems, I mean, they are even now using, for instance, AI to generate some data and some information back in. So these systems have become so advanced that they're a really integral tool in any industry or any organization of a certain size. But specifically in the procurement function, it's very important. So if you're interested in the procurement field, I would definitely say maintaining or developing an understanding of an ERP system is huge, and it'll benefit you. But at the ERP level, it'll benefit you not just in procurement, but if you move into some other area of the organization, such as finance or HR, understanding of the ERP is really important. What can be a part of the ERP, but I don't want to confuse them as the same thing, is an e-procurement system. So an e-procurement system is generally going to be, it can be a part of an ERP system. It can be its own system as well. But basically, it manages the procurement to pay cycle. So in the procurement cycle, we can manage RFQs. So we can manage requests for proposals or requests for quotations. We can do tender processes in an e-procurement tool. We can compare bids. You can do auctions, which is a really interesting a really interesting procurement tool as well. A procurement system or purchasing system will allow us to automate the process of purchasing goods and services. So we're moving away from that time in the industry where you would get an email saying, please send me a quote, or can you prepare a proposal? And as you can imagine, it adds and lends to a lot more formality of the process. It allows us to really ensure that our procurement processes are strong, and it lends to more compliance, less room for corruption, etc. So generally, in an e-procurement system, you can send purchase requisitions, generate purchase orders, manage your vendors, etc. Another interesting part of an e-procurement system, which is very great at bringing efficiency, is that you can automate some tasks that tend to be repetitive. So if, for instance, you know that every month there is a certain level of a certain product that you need, you can automate that. And that type of technology is becoming really important in procurement departments and procurement processes. So really, I would say, just talking about the benefits of an e-procurement system, I think I've gone through most of them. One thing I would say that I didn't mention that's actually quite important is it also allows for better supplier and vendor relationships, because you're able to approve purchase orders and invoices more swiftly. So that will help your vendors with cash flow and clear payments on time. I think it goes without saying that in procurement, the relationship between your suppliers or your contractors is hugely important. And so you just always need to make sure that that's being appropriately managed. And an e-procurement system really helps you do that. So next, we'll go into the types of procurement. So here are the main types of procurement. We have indirect procurement, direct procurement, and services procurement. So I think I'll start actually, not at the beginning, but I'll go into indirect procurement, because indirect procurement is normally the type of procurement that relates to goods or services that are necessary for internal use of an organization. So if you could think about it, what types of things would that be? It would be things like travel or utilities, gas, water, lights, etc. Management of the building, management of the facilities. It could be technology. It could be computers, phones, etc. But another big part of indirect procurement could be indirect spend. That could be management training, HR, recruitment. It could be external professional services. So that goes into the services procurement. So I would definitely say that indirect procurement and services procurement are linked. It could be marketing. So that's a type of indirect procurement. So that's what indirect procurement realm is. And we'll get to the question afterwards, which I think is quite interesting, of what's more important, indirect procurement or direct procurement. So I'd like you to think about that and think about how these types of procurement would fit into the organization. Direct procurement is actually the purchase of goods or materials or services that would be directly applied into an organization's production. Okay, our own production of materials, goods, or services. So these are things we need directly to make other things. Some examples of direct procurement are going to be raw materials, machinery. If it's a resale operation, products that would be resold. And so direct procurement is often accredited with the management of product quality and operational performance and the customer experience. And it has really closely linked with the manufacturing process or the production process. Those are the types of inputs we need for that process, and that's what would come out of direct procurement. But as I mentioned, I mean, there is a debate of which one is more important. Okay, so on one hand, direct procurement, it's what drives external profits. It's the thing that's responsible for revenue, for cost, quality, performance. Those are all things linked to direct procurement. However, indirect procurement is what makes the organization run. It's the day-to-day functionality of an organization. So even though it may not seem to be the hot ticket item that we need to get the job done, if you don't have that back room moving, if there's no paper in the printers, if your staff isn't trained in HR techniques, or if you don't have the computers that we need to run the organization, then the manufacturing and production doesn't really happen. So I think that's why it's interesting to think about the link between direct and indirect procurement. And I think the answer to which one is more important from my position would be neither. They're inextricably linked. And I think it's important that we understand that. Okay. Without a product, there's no market and no need for indirect procurement. So I think we have to understand how those two are linked. Okay. So now we're getting to the process flow chart. So this is the nuts and bolts of what is procurement. I've talked a lot about the types of procurement. Now I want to talk more about the process of procurement. And generally in any organization, the procurement process it will be really similar. So if you start working in a very small company and maybe you don't have a big ERP system or an e-procurement system, but you're working at buying and selling on a smaller level, in some ways you still will follow this system. And even in the biggest corporate organizations, you'll see the system and it's much more formalized. And the reason I think it's important that we understand the system is because no matter what type of organization you're in or what industry you're in, a procurement process flow is a really important tool that will allow you to optimize your procurement. And if you're in an organization that maybe some of the steps that I'll outline here are not formalized in your organization, it's a great thing to consider that and consider whether that needs to be formalized and whether that would make your procurement system much more robust. And remember, every step doesn't have to add inefficiency. I think it's important to understand that. Even if you add an extra step, it doesn't need to be an inefficient step. It can be a step that will actually add integrity and add cost savings to your process. So think about that, okay? Let's start at what I call step 0. in the 7 stages of procurement. So step 0 is actually the needs recognition. Someone in the organization decides that they need something, okay? And they decide that they need that thing, and they come to the procurement department, and they decide, okay, this is an item that I need. So there's some questions to ask as a procurement professional. Is there a real need for that thing or that service? Okay. Very often we'll come and someone will say, oh, well, we really have a requirement for this. And the organization has to decide, and normally there's a process by which the organization decides if that thing is needed. And that generally is at the purchase requisition stage. So Bob will decide he needs a widget, and Bob will need to get management approval that we really do need that widget. So once we come to the contracts and procurement department with that purchase requisition, then we can ask the question is, do we have another way to obtain that item for the end user that may not need the entire process flow here? Maybe we have an existing contract already for 1,000 widgets, and if we buy 1,001, that's a way for us to get it really quickly for the end user. And then if it's something maybe that has some type of regulatory approval, so let's stick with our widget example. If Bob wants to buy a widget that maybe has some type of nuclear material in it or something, there may be an agency or something, a regulatory body with which we need to go to in order to proceed with purchasing that thing. So these are the questions we ask at the purchase requisition stage. So that's generally where we would have a review by the procurement department, the manager. At that point, we would also maybe bring in finance if it's something that could have cost implications for the company. We want to make sure that we have the financing available. So that's what we call review by the procurement and finance team. So that's the blue box that we have here. And then we go back after our review, we say approve or reject. If we reject it, if we say, you know what, this is not something we need or not something we're prepared to purchase at this moment, it goes back to the person who initiated the request with the reason for that. And that gives them the opportunity, maybe they change the request. Maybe they say, I don't really need this type of thing, but I need this. Or maybe they say, well, there's a more cost-effective way that we can do this. So instead of having the top of the line gold-plated widget, I can easily do with a wooden one. And that's a decision that they would then make, and then maybe come back in and with a new purchase requisition that would alter that request. So then we go to, if we do approve it, that's the creation of a purchase order. I'll get I think it's the next slide. Yes, I'll get in the next slide on what is a purchase order versus a contract, etc. But so then we have the creation of a purchase order, which this step can come in towards the end as well. So in every organization, you may not see it like this, but it can happen here. So then once we decide we have that need, we send out multiple requests for quotations, okay? Of course, and we go back to efficiency. In deciding how you go about asking for quotations will depend a lot on the value of the thing. So if we have something that is fairly low value, we don't want to spend internally, if we're buying something that's say $200, we don't want to have an internal process that causes us to spend $5,000 to buy that $200 thing. It's just not efficient. So when we are undertaking the procurement process, we really need to look at the value of something. So if it's something of a fairly minor value, we may say, okay, well, we only need 2 quotations just to make sure that what we're spending on that item is reasonable within the market. But of course, if it's something that's has a very high value, we will have a very formalized process where we may, for instance, publish an expression of interest in the market, where an expression of interest is a great tool because it gives you market intelligence. So generally an expression of interest is published, you can publish it in newspapers, trade magazines, etc. And expressions of interest are a way for companies to come to you and say, yes, you need to buy that thing, and I am the person who can sell it to you. And it's not necessarily at an expression of interest stage where you'll receive quotations or look at numbers or tenders. It's really just companies raising their hand and saying, you've identified that you have a need, and we think we can fulfill that need. So after the expression of interest stage, generally, if it's something that's very high value, you can even add another stage in there, which could be some type of pre-qualification, where you look at everyone who's responded to your expression of interest and you say, okay, well, let's make it a little bit more specific. So I need that thing, but I need it with these particular components. Can this company meet my requirements? And from there, you take, if you received 20 responses to your EOI, you whittle it down to companies that may be more suited to do the specific thing that you require. And then after a pre-qualification, then you can say, okay, now we have the list of the companies that we would like to give us quotations or proposals to purchase this thing or to purchase this service. And that's when you would send out a request for quotation. So I'll give a little bit of lingo here. You'll hear RFQ. RFQ is a request for a quotation. You'll also hear RFP, which is a request for a proposal. A quotation tends to be for things that are simpler, where you don't need a large technical briefing on how the contractor intends to do the service, or a big technical briefing on the item that they will provide. An RFQ generally will be for fairly standard stock items, things that it's fairly easy and simple to provide. And then occasionally, just in case you're reading through procurement items, you'll see RFX, and that's just basically a placeholder for if it's an RFQ or an RFP. Okay. So we've gone through. You've decided what you need. You've engaged with the market. You've requested quotations or proposals, and now you have an analysis of the vendor and selection of a vendor. In each organization, this can be dealt with differently. Even for each process within an organization, it can be dealt with differently. But generally, you want to have a technical evaluation of the quotation proposal that's provided, and you want to have a commercial evaluation. You can do those together. You can do those simultaneously. You can do those concurrently. Or you can decide that, listen, in this particular process, really, this is such a technical item or a technical service that we need. Cost is important, but it's almost secondary. Let's do a technical analysis. And if they don't pass technically, we're not even going to look at the cost. So we just close it on a technical basis. Or there can be analysis that's done where you look at the technical and the cost at the same time, and then you make a joint analysis. There are all sorts of ways to do it, and each organization will be different. As I mentioned, it could also be different within an organization for different tender processes. And also, if you have a technical specification that's fairly simple, if we're buying, 1,000 pencils, as long as the technical end user tells you those pencils need to be yellow and they need to be a certain length, if they are, then that's really all the technical analysis you need. So that's when you would really look at the commercial as being the most important part of the analysis and the vendor selection. I think it's important also just to note that sometimes in the technical evaluation, you realize that you weren't really clear in what you requested or what was asked for. So at this stage, there may be some back and forth between yourselves and the tenderers to ask questions. And it also is a time in between when you send requests for quotes and when you open quotes for them to ask questions of you to clarify what your requirement is. And occasionally in the process of a technical evaluation, you'll realize that what you asked for really wasn't what you needed, that every quotation you've gotten doesn't meet your technical requirements. And on the occasion that does happen, that's when you have to step back, look at where you are in the process, potentially cancel that tender, go back to the drawing board and start over. So in the analysis and selection of a vendor and in analysis and selection of quotations and proposals, it's a stage where you have to be flexible, but you also have to work within the processes and procedures that you're given. The next step, which happens to be my personal favorite, probably because of my background, is the negotiation of the contract. Again, it can be very, very simple. This is when I said it could be sending the purchase order to a supplier. So supplier, he's given us the pencils or the widgets or whatever it is that we want. We send a purchase order to them. We've already signed it. They sign the purchase order, and it's done. Or for more complex transactions, that's when we would look at doing a contract. And I'll go into that more on the next slide. Finally, remember, it's not done until you receive the goods or services and then you pay, which is the most important part to the supplier or the contractor. So you receive the goods and services. Generally, service is done great. The good is received in good condition. We receive them. You receive the invoice. There's a three-way match that's done on the invoice. I'll get into three-way matching in a few minutes. But generally, a three-way match is where you look at the process where you compare the purchase order, the goods receipt note, which is saying, or a service completion note in the terms of services, and you look at the invoice. And when you see there's a three-way match, everything's great. They've delivered as per the purchase order. The invoice is as per the purchase order. The goods receipt or the service completion says that it's done. We're good to go. After a three-way match, invoice is paid. Once we pay the vendor, that's the process. Okay. So hopefully that's clear, but of course, if there's any questions, we'll feel free to pick those up at the end. Okay, so we talked about purchase orders, we talked about contracts. I'll run through this fairly quickly, but a contract is generally a document that it details all of the agreed terms. It will generally be more robust than a purchase order, but but there's a really big distinction between a contract and a purchase order. Okay, generally in a purchase order is a document that when you send the purchase order, generally you send a purchase order already signed by the organization, and then when the supplier or contractor receives the purchase order and they accept the purchase order, that's it, you're done. Okay, a contract generally tends to be more robust. It is binding terms between the contractor and the organization. Okay, now how do we decide which one do we use? One of the things we can look at is the duration of the engagement. Is it a long-term engagement or short-term engagement? Generally, a purchase order will be a single transaction, and a contract you'll use for more long-term commitments, long-term arrangements. Contracts generally will have in them or can have in them an option to renew. So if you have a contract that's for a year, at some point in the contract, you can decide to renew that contract for an additional year, for example. Okay. Another important element in deciding whether you want to go with a contract or a purchase order is the legalities and the protecting your business interest. As I mentioned, POs are commercial documents and contracts are legally binding documents. And POs do not become legally binding until the seller actually accepts them. The contract, on the other hand, is a legal document that starts when both parties sign it. Okay. So the two documents are different because the purchase orders have no value unless the seller approves and accepts it. Another thing to consider in deciding which one to use is risk. Okay. Generally, the riskier the transaction, you want to use a contract. Contracts hold more legal value than a purchase order generally. And in situations where there's a significant risk, a contract generally is more robust. So it'll spell out very directly the obligations of the party. And they generally will reduce your risk exposure. A purchase order will not address all situations. No contract document will address all situations either, but generally contracts are robust enough that if you find yourself in a certain situation, it would have been considered in the contract document itself. So that's generally the difference between a contract and a purchase order. Purchase orders can be really convenient because they're generally easy. There's generally standard T's and C's that you can apply that suppliers and contractors will be used to. Contracts are a little bit more difficult and take a bit more negotiating, but if that's something you enjoy, it's a great opportunity to get to do that. Okay, so quickly we're going to go through one area which I think is hugely important. I think it's close to my last slide. I think I have 2 more slides after this. But this is about procurement pitfalls and peaks, and this is actually quite important. So becoming a trusted advisor to the business through this study is one of the most critical goals for a procurement department. And that's followed by reduced purchasing cost. So you would think that reducing purchasing costs would be the most important. So I was actually quite surprised when I saw this, this statistic from the study. Elevate the role of procurement to a trusted advisor to the business. So what does that mean? I think for when I read that, I think what it means is knowing that the procurement department is a department within the company that really is there to ensure that the business is operating at peak performance, and that the business is getting all of the value, that the procurement department is really contributing to the bottom line. Okay, and contributing to the bottom line is not just contributing by saving money, but efficiency as well, because as we know, time is money. So we have to find that balance between efficiency and cost savings to company. So how do you do that? And I think a really important part and a really important point here is compliance. Okay. So what is compliance? So generally compliance is rules. I mean, when you comply with something, that means you're following a rule. But generally regulatory compliance are goals that organizations aspire to so that we can achieve in our efforts to ensure that we're not in violation of any relevant laws, company policies, company procedures, etc. Okay. So compliance in procurement can ensure that there's governance in many different areas of the organization. Okay. But the potential financial losses and legal penalties that can arise by failing to comply with government industry guidelines are huge. And it's really important that we understand what the risks are if we don't have a robust compliance program in place. And those risks can be bribery and corruption, which, I don't think anyone needs a definition of that. We can make sure that we ensure good employee behavior. So that's things like ensuring there's no discrimination and harassment in your workplace. So having guidelines in place to police employee behavior is really important. Again, we go back to my very first slide, workplace health and safety. So having a compliance process in place around HSE is hugely important. Our environmental impact, we can go there. Data management is another area where compliance is huge. And data management in contracts and procurement is really important, because if we go back to the procurement process, all of that has to be documented, filed, stored, recorded, because along with compliance comes audit. And I haven't done a slide on audit, but it's a huge part of the industry and part of one of the tools that we use in procurement. And then actually, I don't have it on my compliance tools, but audit is definitely a really important tool. And then quality. So having a compliance program in place will ensure that the product or services that we are producing or that we are receiving meets industry standards, legal quality standards, as outlined. Okay. And finally, social responsibility. It's really important that we show a robust compliance process in place, because it shows that we're committed to ensuring the safety of not only the things that we produce, but also our people and also the environment. Okay. So those are the compliance risks. Okay. And what are our tools? We've already talked about policies and procedures. One of the things is due diligence. That's huge for the compliance risks that we need to address towards bribery or corruption. And due diligence can be an unfamiliar term, but basically it can be summed up in knowing who you're doing business with, knowing who your contractors and suppliers are, knowing that your contractors and suppliers are people or organizations that will have the policies and procedures in place so that your compliance risk is quite low. Of course, there's always training, company codes of conduct, and more important is ensuring that your suppliers and vendors have ensuring that your supplier and vendors have codes of conduct, but also ensuring that we have, or your organization has, a code of conduct that you expect and that you pass on and you explain to your suppliers and vendors that this is how we intend, this is how we work, and this is how we expect you to work. So we've already talked about, I think, the tools and the compliance risks. So in order to mitigate these risks, I would definitely say if your organization doesn't have a compliance program in place, start one. It can start with basic policies and procedures and grow more robust as your organization grows. But I think the basis of any world-class organization in this day and age is ensuring that you have some type of compliance procedure or program in place. So with that, ending on compliance, which I think is hugely important, I will move on to the references that I've used for the information that I've had today. And then I will say thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I really am happy that I'm able to contribute to the mission of MWE. It's a laudable one, and I thank everyone who has contributed to making this happen. So, Gizela, I think I now can hand it over to you if there are any questions or anything else I can answer.
Thank you, Lee, for this amazing presentation. I work in the same area, so it was really nice, at least for me, and I think that everyone, all the attendees here, they liked a lot. Let's go to the questions. Let me start by saying I saw a question from Stelio. Yes, this will be available in the YouTube page of MWE. The presentation is being recorded, so you can go there and you'll find all the presentation. So let's go to our first question. It's from an anonymous attendee, and he's asking, what's the one thing you believe should always be in a contract between a contractor and a subcontractor?
Okay, so that's a really great question. And I would definitely say looking at clauses that have to do specifically with terminations or suspensions. When you start a project, everybody always hopes that everything will work out for the best. But it's very, very important that you think, unfortunately, slightly pessimistically about what happens if we face problems. So that can be anything from a performer not performing very well to having a project that you decide all of a sudden you may not need. So I think some of the most important clauses and the clauses that you need to make sure that are robust for your organization are those related to issues where there are problems with the contract. So I always say when you're drafting a contract or you're reviewing a contract, think about the scenarios that can happen and think about, well, if this happens, are we adequately covered? So I would definitely say looking at the clauses related to if things don't work out quite as you planned.
Okay, thank you, Lee, for this answer. Let's go to the next question. What was the greatest challenge you faced moving over from law to subcontracting?
I would say probably Excel. No, I mean, I used to joke that I went to law school because I didn't like math in high school. But it's only a joke. I think, you know, going from an area where it's very based in reading and jurisprudence, you know, that's why I say I love the contract negotiation side of it. But in really tough negotiations, you have to have a grasp of the finance, the commercial aspect of it. You have to be really quick on the numbers. You have to be able to look at proposals, look at the numbers, spot anomalies. You have to be able to be very versatile in the tools. And I joke about Excel, but it's a fantastic tool. You have to really be able to process data in a way that is that you're able to analyze data quickly, but very efficiently and to get into the data. So I would say that was probably a challenge for me, but something that I was able to overcome because I went from, you know, being very versatile and very focused on the reading and writing side. And then I had to really shift over into data analysis. And it's hugely important.
Thank you, Lee. We have one more here. It's from Simiao. He's asking how you deal with delays in delivery or execution.
It depends on the situation. It really depends. It depends on why there's been a delay. Very often there can be delays that are the fault of company. It happens. You have a project that needs to be delivered, and the client needs information from one of your engineers about a certain component, and that engineer just doesn't get back to them, and then there's a delay. There are delays that are completely attributed to the supplier or the contractor. And those cases are much more straightforward. But in dealing with the delays, you have to analyze, what are my other options? Because very often the best thing for the organization is not to say, oh, this is late, we're going to cancel this contract or this purchase order and move on. Because then you have to do another procurement process that could move you back to getting that thing that you need and can move your timeline back. So in dealing with delays, I think communication between the supplier and the contractor is hugely important. Why is there a delay? Is there a way for us to make up that delay? Very often there may be ways to make up that missed schedule, or is that delay affecting your, is it affecting the entire project schedule? Is it on what we call critical path? It may not be. So that's one way, is having that communication and finding out ways to manage the delay. If it is something that's completely the fault of the supplier, they're just not performing. One way you can use in contracts, we have something called liquidated damages, which are damages in the event that there's delay. But then even if you decide to apply liquidated damages, you have to think, okay, if I apply liquidated damages and the contractor just decides that, it's not even worth it, I'm just going to walk away from this, right? Let's say the liquidated damages add up to more than what the contractor will ultimately make if he finishes the project, and the contract just walks away, and you don't get that good or service that you need. Is that really the best option for the organization? So there's a lot that you have to factor into how you handle delays or non-performance. And you just have to analyze every situation individually and find out what's the best way in order to meet the organization's objectives.
Thank you, Lee. The next one is how you deal with conflict of interest in the procurement department.
It goes back to compliance report. I've had instances where I felt that maybe I've known someone who's worked for a supplier, or I have had a family member who may have worked with a supplier or a contractor at one point in time, and you raise your hand, you be completely transparent. And you say, listen, you go to your organization, you go to your manager, your supervisor, you go to your compliance department, and you say, I have this situation. I believe that I could have a potential conflict of interest. You let them evaluate the situation. And then in my case, and what I prefer is, even if there's an appearance, I say, I don't want to be involved in this particular process. And you find someone else in your organization who can lead that. In procurement, like in any industry, I think really our reputation is hugely important to to how we professionally are able to manage our careers. So even the appearance of impropriety, whether there's really impropriety or not, is something you absolutely want to avoid. So I think in terms of personal conflicts of interest, the best thing is if you feel that there's even a slight chance that something could look like there is a conflict there, to report it, and then to take yourself out of the situation where there could be any type of accusation that there is a conflict there.
Thank you, Lee. Next one is from Ivandra. She says, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. What would be your advice for a young professional that wants to enter the procurement field? And can you mention some important skills necessary to work in this area?
Advice that I would give is, as I mentioned before, the great thing about procurement is you can join the procurement community from many different types of backgrounds. So as I mentioned, it can be engineering, it can be law, it can be services provision, it can be a myriad of backgrounds and avenues. So that's one thing I will say is, don't let your professional or your educational background hold you back if you're interested in a procurement career. Necessary skills, I would say attention to detail is huge. Attention to detail and critical thinking. The fun thing about a procurement career is every day is different. You're not doing the same thing every day. But that also means that when you're faced with a problem, like we just discussed about maybe a delay issue, you have to be able to look at it and think critically and analyze the situation and say, okay, well, this supplier is late, so liquidated damages, because that's what the contract says. That may not be what's best for the organization. So I think really being able to analyze a situation, looking at the detail, and being able to look at the big picture of what's best for the organization, but then look at the small picture as well and be able to analyze the data and in order to decide what's best for company. So.
Okay, thank you. Next one from Daisy. She says, thank you for the presentation. I learned a lot with it. As for your explanation, in procurement, many risks are faced and compliance is highly taken into account. During your career, what was the most challenging business risk you faced during the procurement process?
Challenging business risk. I would definitely say it would be a risk that relates to ensuring that you have compliance in the area of due diligence, knowing who you're working with. And I say that in due diligence, not necessarily always on bribery and corruption, but also in knowing the background and the history of the suppliers you work with. That also includes, financial history, because everyone will offer to provide you a good or a service at a certain price. But if you find a contractor that maybe isn't strong enough financially, or maybe has some issues that relate to, for instance, they may have legal problems that they're facing and they're just not able to perform, you're starting out with a contractor who's already limping. So you're never really going to get to the end because you didn't do your due diligence and learn enough about that potential supplier, potential contractor to know that they really can't get the job done. Sometimes the glossiest flyer that you get is not the best option to go with. So I think doing that doing the background, doing the research, doing the hard work into knowing who your suppliers are, what their capabilities really are. And then also it goes back to making sure you're working with reputable suppliers, because your supplier's reputation is directly linked to yours and your organization. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges and something that I think we particularly need to look out for.
Thank you. The next one, it's from Simiao again, saying how you spot a bad supplier and how you deal with such suppliers.
I wish I knew.
Yeah.
I wish I knew. It would make my life much easier if I could immediately identify who the bad suppliers are. I don't think there's such a thing as a bad supplier. I think suppliers, you have some companies that sometimes they bite off a little bit more than they can chew and they're not able to perform. You have some companies that could go through management or financial problems, so they're not able to perform. But if you do your job as a procurement professional, there shouldn't be a bad supplier. I mean, you don't go to a guy who sells, shoes if you want shovels. It's that simple, right? So if you do your job as a procurement professional, that guy doesn't sell shovels. He doesn't produce shovels. I'm not going to him. So unless you get your job completely wrong, there's no quote unquote bad supplier. And then how do you deal with suppliers when they run into problems? It's just like I said, you have to be flexible. You have to have a contract in place that protects the company, that protects your interests, so you can use that contract if you fall into a situation that you have to. But I think also at the same time, you have to think about what are your ultimate organizational aims.
Okay, next one from Marta. She's asking, what are the main common risks that are often associated with procurement in major energy or infrastructure projects in developing countries like Mozambique?
I would definitely say technical expertise, but that's improving, and it's improving with things like what we're doing now, right? I arrived in Mozambique 12 years ago, and I've been able to see huge improvements in the technical expertise in this country. And that only goes with when we are here and we are working in major energy or infrastructure projects. Local content development is hugely important. And it's important because it allows us as companies that have invested in Mozambique in order to really reap that investment in country. And it brings things it brings that technical know-how into the country. But that has to start somewhere, and it won't start on day zero. But like we've seen here in Mozambique, that technical expertise can grow and can develop. And so I think that is one of the challenges that you see in developing countries. I think a secondary challenge would go back to what I said about HSE. I've been in other countries. I think this is one thing that actually Mozambique is advanced in, but I've been in other countries in other parts of the world where introducing that safety culture can be very difficult. People don't understand. They say, well, I'm selling you a service. Why do you care if I do it safely or not? You know, we're not your company. We shouldn't do things by your safety rules. Why, in order to do business with you, do I have to do things to a certain safety standard? And you have to explain to these suppliers, these contractors, that it's not about you following our rules. It's about the fact that we value human life, we value human dignity, we value the environment. And in us valuing those things, we will only work with people who understand those values and who will value them as well. So it's not about rule enforcement. It's about ensuring that we work with partners who have common goals and visions and identity. So I would definitely say technical expertise and developing a safety culture are two common risks and challenges that we can face in these environments.
Okay, we have two more here. And the question is, do you think that some steps in procurement add bureaucracy and delays to the process? Is fast-track procurement possible?
So as a procurement manager, I cannot say with a straight face that any part of the process adds bureaucracy. No, but I get it. I mean, like the point I tried to make is that if you're buying something really simple, you don't need 10 quotations. You don't need 10. You might need 2. So there's a way to take the steps in the process and to tailor them to what you actually need. Fast track procurement, it's a possibility. Like I mentioned, all of the steps about an EOI and a PQQ and requesting proposals. If it's something really simple, you don't need an EOI. You don't need a pre-qualification necessarily. You may go straight to going to the market and saying, I need this, give me prices for this thing. So again, I stress, going back to one of the answers I had before about skills that you need to excel in the procurement world, critical thinking is huge because, you know, as much as I love my procurement policies and procedures, if you come to me and you say, you know, as a manager, if I have someone on my team who is buying something that costs a couple $100 and they've just spent, you know, $15,000 publishing in the newspaper for this very small thing that we need and going through each of the procurement process cycles, you know, that's not really critical, the kind of critical thinking that we want to be using in the industry. So absolutely, you're exactly right. Fast track procurement is possible. And I think we need to find ways to use the steps in the procurement process efficiently. And there are some steps that can be eliminated depending on the certain circumstance and what you're buying. So absolutely.
Okay. One more here in the chat from Nilza. She says, procurement process often tends to be complicated to both requesting unit and the potential vendors. So how can this be surpassed to ensure fair and equal participation, especially in cases where tenders quit in the mid of the bid?
I think it goes back to that, to communication. I think it also goes back to targeting your requirements appropriately. If you have something that you think is not, if you have a project, let's say, I'm trying to think of a good example. If you have a project and you know that your requirements, your need for that project are just too much for a particular vendor, that at this time in the development of the company, they're not able to meet the demands of your RFP generally, that's when vendors will get really frustrated, and that's when they will drop out in the middle. If, for instance, you know that a particular company doesn't have a really robust due diligence process, and you send them a due diligence request that's 25 pages long, something that we would expect another company just to send to their due diligence department, but this company has no idea. That's when you find that happening most often. So I think tailoring your initial vendors list to companies that can meet your requirements. But on the other side of that, which I think is hugely important, and is hugely important for the local content side, is looking for those local content opportunities where, I know that a local Mozambique company can do this job. So how do I market and tailor my RFQ and my procurement process in a way that I can get those guys in the door, right? So yes, we may need to have a session in the middle of the tendering process where we explain to them what is due diligence, why do we have a due diligence procedure? And when I say them, I mean all of the tenders, because you also have to always make sure you're treating everyone fairly. But if you know that you're working with suppliers that maybe can't get over that hump, work into the process technical clarifications that will allow them to progress through. So just to use due diligence for an example, instead of sending them a 20-page due diligence questionnaire, what you do is you have an open session for all of the possible tenderers, and you explain to them what your due diligence process is. You explain to them the paperwork that they'll be required to figure out. You tell them what they need so they can get ready. They can start collecting those things, right? And then they feel like they understand the system, the process, why you're doing things. And I find that will more often than not get those contractors over the hurdle and get them to be able to put in good proposals. I've had an instance where, we had a contractor. In this particular case, it was a sole source scenario. So it wasn't an open competition, but I received an Excel spreadsheet and I realized that they had spent 3 days working on this Excel spreadsheet, but they were using Excel like a typewriter. So they were putting in all the numbers and then at the end doing all the figures. And I got the guy and I said, look, you can do this for you. It will do this for you. You don't have to do this. And it was just that sort of training and coaching that allowed them to get over the line. And ultimately they got a contract with us and it was hugely transformational for that particular company. So I think we have a balance in the procurement area. We have to balance best value for company. We have to balance these processes and procedures, but local content is so important. It's hugely important. And we have to think about what we need to do and what we can do to get those local companies over the line.
Well, this one is from me. I would like, you have experience in this huge industry. What would be, on your opinion, the weight of importance of procurement in the whole project? We have different phases. You said that we have procurement in all these phases, but when we say, okay, 100% the project, what is the weight of the procurement there?
Of course, I'm going to say like huge, right?
Yes.
No, say we have 100% of the project. I would say that procurement, we touch so many different areas that I would definitely say, 50%. I mean, if we didn't have procurement, the technical guys wouldn't have the tools that they needed to get the job done, right? If we didn't have procurement, the pre-studies and the pre-feeds that we need to do to find out if the project is even viable wouldn't be done. So, I mean, if you look at every, on that I think was the second slide that I showed, if you look at everything in every step of the way, so at some point procurement, we touch it, right? And I think that's hugely important. And so I think it's a really good way to demonstrate how varied and how interesting a procurement role can be. And then you even talk about procurement against different industries. So we're talking about oil and gas, but let's talk about procurement in the setting of environment, or procurement in a setting of government procurement or public procurement, which is a whole nother area, which is hugely interesting and has different norms. So it's not just procurement in a process, but it's procurement across huge industries in different parts of the world. And so I would definitely say, if you had to give me a number, if I had to give you a number, I have to give you 50%.
Yes, and I agree. Yes, we have a great role in every step of the project. So yes, I think 50% is fair. So we got one more question here, saying how is a typical work day like a procurement job?
It depends. So for instance, it depends on what you're working on. I've had procurement jobs where I've put on a suit every day and I've gone into an office and I've sat behind a desk and I've had meetings and I've done that. I've also done a procurement job where I've put on boots every day. I've been on a work site. I've spent my day walking around, talking to my technical engineers, meeting contractors, hard hat, PPE, living in a camp. I've done that too. I've done procurement jobs when I've been 3 hours away from the closest city, to procurement jobs like what I currently do. I have an office in the middle of Maputo. So it depends on what your day looks like. But generally, because different procurement processes are so varied, and you generally will have things at different stages in the procurement process. You could spend your day managing a new process, working with an end user who says they need something. How are we going to procure this for you? You could do that. You could also at the same time be working on evaluation of bids. So you could spend your morning looking at Excel spreadsheets, putting together tables, comparing pricing. You could, one of my favorite things are site visits, which are really fun, which is where you actually, if you're working on a project that has a project site, taking contractors or potential suppliers to site to visit where that thing will be built or the installation. And that's really what you can get into the technical side of it. So someone like me who's not an engineer, but really enjoys it, you get that opportunity to liaise with engineers and understand what needs to be done. You get to do the fun stuff sometimes too as well. Like when you finally do all the hard work and you're ready to sign that contract, standing there and handing whoever has that authority to sign that particular contract the pen and feeling really accomplished that you went through that whole procurement cycle that you saw and you got the job done and that you hopefully got best value for the company. And then I'll add one more thing to that. So I said signing the contract, but I don't really think that's the best part. The best part is when you see that thing, that good or that service or that project completed. If it's building that building, when you see that building and you open the door for the first time, if it's developing that new technology, that new product, and you see it in use for the first time, that's really a great moment. So typical day can look like a lot of different things, depends on the project, depends on the place, depends on the organization. But I think that's the great thing about procurement.
Thank you. Yes, that's really great. We have the opportunity to, I would say, know all the company in the different areas because we deal with all the chain, everything inside the company. We have the opportunity to go there and see, okay, how this department or that discipline works. We get to understand it, and it's a lot of knowledge for us, and that's really good. We don't have more questions. I don't see any here. I don't see any in the chat. So this means I think our attendees are very happy right now. It was a very good presentation. Let me thank you, Lee, for sharing this knowledge. It's very valuable for us all. It was just super perfect, I would say. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity. It was fantastic, and I really appreciate it. And good luck to everyone. And if there's any questions, always happy to answer questions afterwards. So definitely, if you guys want to pass on anything to me, happy to answer them. Okay.
Yes, of course, Lee will do that. So let me remind just to all the attendees that they can find this presentation in the YouTube MWA page. And this is all for today. Thank you all for your presence. We see you all in the next episode.